Hey, what's up? My name is Yancey Strickler, and welcome to my desktop. A few weeks ago, I was invited by an audience of artists to give a talk reflecting on some of my creative experiences to date. And while these are things I often write about, they're not things that I had really given close thought. And invited by this prompt, I reflected a bit on things that I've done. And there were a set of 9 what I'm calling creative meditations, or just ways of approaching my work and any creative work that I thought others might benefit from hearing about. So I've decided to release this as a PDF that you can read, very simple, lots of visuals, as well as just this talk, so you can hear what I have to say in person. The text will be similar to the PDF, probably a little bit different because I want to be alive and fresh while doing this. But my career, I began as someone who grew up on a farm in Southwest Virginia. I was a music critic for a long time, co-founded Kickstarter, The Creative Independent, wrote a book about rethinking value, led and edited a book about how we live online, and I'm now working on a project called Metalabel. And as I looked at all these projects, it felt like there's a clear trajectory that seems almost premeditated, but it was entirely accidental. All along, I've just been acting according to my curiosity, and there's just been interesting things that have popped up. But I think it's important to realize that, first we just live, then we learn, and finally we narrate. It's in retrospect that we get a sense of what we were doing. It's the idea of praxis. You do something and then figure out why later. And I think that's true of almost everything I'm going to share here today. Now, the things I'm going to share, these are specific to my experience, but you're going to have your own version of that. And I would encourage anyone to take the time to write down and reflect on things that they've learned that others might benefit from. So the creative tension that's felt the strongest to me throughout my entire career is this pull between finding my own voice and then trying to be like everybody else. Especially when we're consuming a lot of media, which we're all doing right now, there's a very strong pull to just make your voice like other things you see, this urge to converge. The mid-twit meme illustrates this well, where in the center of the bell curve, where most people are, you have people worrying about what is everybody else doing and how can I or should I be like that? And on either end of this bell curve are people who are either too smart or too dumb to care, and instead they just act on their own desires. And this is what's important to do as a creative person, but it's also hard. Miles Davis had a line about sometimes it takes you a long time to find your voice. It's not an easy thing. I really enjoy the way the artist and musician Brian Eno approaches this, including his project Oblique Strategies. He often counsels that you should find what's strange or even bad about your work and exaggerate it, accentuate it even more. That's a way to make work that's more me than the mean. A lot of times when we create, we are trying to picture someone that we're creating for. And in fact, we maybe imagine that there's some huge audience of billions of people that might come flock to us and give us flowers. If we just use the right combination of words or make our video exactly right, they'll just show up. And so we make work picturing these throngs of people and we anticipate them and try to make something that will please them. But this is not the right way to make creative work. Instead, we should see ourselves as being the audience. We should imagine that we're looking into a mirror and we're asking ourselves, what do we want? What do we want as a fan of the type of work that we make? Or what do we crave as an audience member from other cultural projects? What do you appreciate or not appreciate? When we try to anticipate this faceless mass, we lose our voice and we get lost. But yet if we just think about what we ourselves want, it becomes much more clear. An artist friend of mine has said to me that what's most personal is what's most universal. That thing that's closest and dearest to us, that's the thing that's going to connect with other people. It's not trying to express a universal belief, it's expressing exactly where we come from that will connect with others and say something that feels true. Imagine it's your birthday and you're throwing a party at a restaurant. Early on, your closest friends are there. It's great, it's good to see them. But you invited a lot of people, and you keep waiting for them to show up. But the more time goes on, the more they're not there. And suddenly you start to feel panicked and worried. Oh no, is there less love for me in the world than I thought? Is no one going to come? But suddenly the mood shifts, and lots of people show up. Lots more. Everyone you hoped for came. And suddenly it's a huge party. Everyone there to celebrate you. But quickly it becomes overwhelming. You can't have any real conversations with anyone. You're just acting as a constant host. It feels like work. You wish that things could just be quiet again and not so noisy. Well, this is what success is like. We start off with our projects with just us and a few true believers, but we're always anticipating this future audience that we want to attract, and we feel anxious that there aren't more people there, and we often spend more time feeling anxious about who's not there rather than appreciating who is. And the truth is, later on in our career, when we look back, it's those early moments that we most feel nostalgic for. Those times when we didn't know if we were going to make it or not. And it was all wide open. Things weren't yet defined. When things get big, it's very easy to become more conservative. You feel more boxed in. There's a reputation. There's other people to think about. You don't have the freedom that you had early on. Kurt Cobain of Nirvana once talked about how if he could do it all over again, he would have stayed just in the van right before they got big, when they could feel it was starting to happen. If he could have been in that space forever, it would have been perfect. Too often we rush past the early stages of things. We want to get to when we're big, but we don't appreciate these early moments. Small is more rewarding than big. At the start of most projects, we face an invisible choice that we often don't notice. Is this project a practice or is it a cathedral? Now, a cathedral is something that you work behind a curtain and you spend all this time making it perfect. It's intricate and gigantic, and there will be a moment of reveal where the world sees what it is that you've made. A practice, on the other hand, is something that you just do. You just put out into the world. It's more of a metaphysical cathedral. You can have the same values, the same goals, ideals, but you don't need a physical space. You just need to create time and to invite others to participate. Now, practices in cathedrals are often related to one another. I wrote a book called This Could Be Our Future that was very much a cathedral. Spent 2 years on it, feel very proud of that work. And yet it was a community that came out of it, the Bento Society, and a series of meetings and sessions that came out of those ideas, this practice that proved to be more meaningful. When we begin a practice and we continue that practice, there's something else that can happen. It itself can become a cathedral. Other people showing up might volunteer their time. It takes on more of a life of its own. And in fact, practices make some of the strongest cathedrals because they are true to something that people naturally want and desire. There's no right or wrong answer here, but it is good to ask yourself at the start of any project, is this better off as a practice or as a cathedral? One of the hardest things to do as a creative person is to stay true to our voice. And one tactic, one strategy you can use to combat that is world building. Creating a universe around yourself in which your ideas can be justified by some sort of self-contained logic. Especially when we're doing work that's at the edges of what we're comfortable with, of what people already know. Something like this is incredibly helpful. World building frees us up and gives us a place to pull from creatively. Let me give you an example. It's 1966 and the Beatles are going on vacation for the first time, all going their separate ways. Paul McCartney decides that he wants to drive across France, Spain, and Morocco by himself. But of course, he's one of the most famous people in the world. So to do this, he dons a disguise. He wears fake glasses, grows a mustache, and slicks back his hair. And it works. For a whole month, Paul McCartney got to be somebody else, and he found the experience liberating. When he got back to London, he called the other Beatles and told them about what had happened. And he said, "We can't make another Beatles record. We all need the freedom of being somebody else." And this is where Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was born. Considered the first concept album and maybe one of the greatest records ever made, the album came out of a need by the Beatles, the most famous band in the world ever, a need they had to create a sense of resilience and a different perspective on their work. So they made an internal world that they created from, and it inspired them to make their most inspiring work to date. Another example is the musician Sun Ra. He's a free jazz musician who makes very otherworldly, strange music. And this is easy to justify for Sun Ra because, as he explains, he is from Saturn. And as a Saturnian, this is what his music sounds like, and this is why his concerts are hours long. And the Sun Ra Orchestra continues to play now, to this day, almost 100 years after his birth, and they still make music from this other world that it originates from. Now, I myself used this strategy before. When I began working on This Could Be Our Future, my first book, I felt a lot of anxiety about whether I had permission to say the things that I felt needed to be said. And so, rather than struggle with my lack of confidence, I thought back to Paul's experience, and I decided that I would grow a mustache. Or as clean-faced Yancey worried what other people thought, Yancey with a mustache couldn't care less. And strangely enough, this mustache gave me the permission and the strength to write what I needed to write and the sort of creative confidence I need. Now, this tool is available to any of us. It doesn't have to be as blatant as a mustache. It could be an internal logic that you don't even let the audience in on. But world building is a form of creative resilience. So many of these lessons I'm sharing deal with a sense of inner confidence and a struggle that we often feel. And we especially feel this when it comes to some of the tastemakers or the curators in our space or people we look up to, and we often seek their acceptance. But there's a risk to this, as the author C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, as he noted in a piece called The Inner Ring. I'm going to read from the other screen here some of what he says. He says, and the inner ring refers to the most lauded people in your space or people you look up to that you long to be a part of. He writes, "Unless you take measures to present it, the desire for the inner ring in your field is going to be one of the chief motives of your life, from the first day on which you enter your profession until the day you are too old to care. The quest of the inner ring will break your hearts unless you break it. But if you break it, a surprising result will follow. If in your working hours you make the work your end, you will presently find yourself all unawares inside the only circle in your profession that really matters. You will be one of the sound craftspeople, and other sound craftspeople will know it. This group of craftspeople will by no means coincide with the inner ring or the important people in the know. You are indeed snug and safe at the center of something which, seen from without, would look exactly like an inner ring. But the difference is that the secrecy is accidental, and its exclusiveness a byproduct. And no one was led by the lure of the esoteric. This is friendship. It causes perhaps half of all happiness in the world, and no inner ring can ever have it. So when we chase an inner ring, this acceptance of others, we will someday reach that inner ring perhaps, but then we will discover there's only another inner ring further on. And we will come to realize that these things do not track with ability, creativity, any of that. They're just about popularity. And it's only by following our own voice do we liberate ourselves. Another great thinker of the 20th century has an excellent quote about this. Jimmy Buffett once said, "It's ironic. I was never categorizable. Now I'm a category." This is what happens when we stick to our voice. We define a space that people come to recognize and see as being legitimate and real. I experienced this firsthand while co-founding The Creative Independent, a site that does a daily interview or essay by an artist. And we'd run this project for many months, getting great people to speak with us, but really got very little public response. There was not much in the way of positive feedback. But after we'd been doing it for a year, after we crossed the year anniversary, people came out of the woodwork to tell us how much they loved it. And suddenly the Creative Independent was not just this strange thing that we were having to self-justify, but it had earned its place of respect, and other people were giving us that love. But we couldn't do it just by doing it once or even for a month. It took doing it consistently over time. And that is the path that both C.S. Lewis and Jimmy Buffett are speaking of. One of the most surprising things for me in this whole reflection was I recognized that every major breakthrough I've had of a new idea came during a break of working. There's a consistent pattern. I would be working super hard for a long stretch of time, 6 months, grinding out on something. And then I take some time off, a week, a few days, even a month at one point. And during that moment, the synapses connect and some new idea pops out that would not have occurred to me otherwise. And it's just continued to happen. This is how the Creative Independent came up. This was how the idea of bentoism came up. I've been working on my book, This Could Be Our Future, for about a year. And I had a month's break scheduled in the middle. And it was during this time that the core metaphor of the book, this different way of seeing self-interest through these 4 dimensions, just emerged. It's like a year of thinking about it, and then the span of 30 seconds, what you see in this video, this whole different way of seeing just popped out. And I feel it was only because my mind was rested enough to be able to accept it and see what was there. And this also happened a few years ago, after the Bento Society had been running for a few years, and I reached a point of burnout. I had to put things on hiatus, and I gave myself a month to just reset and take stock of where I was. And I used that time to read some books, including a book called Our Band Could Be Your Life that I've read before. It tells the story of punk and hardcore bands in America. And while reading this book, I was struck by how in every case it was some small band in the middle of nowhere or in a big city, but who recorded themselves, wanted to put out what they had recorded, but no record label would do it because they were too noisy. And so instead, these bands would come up with their own label. And their own label was just a name, an identity, a logo, a P.O. box, and they would release themselves. But whenever they did that, this amazing thing would happen where other bands, other artists would show up and say, we make music like you, or we want to make music like you. Will you put us out? And by the time the label's first record would come out, there might be 4 other they've agreed to release. And every time they're putting out one of these releases, they are manifesting more of what they stand for. Every punk record manifests more punkness. Every hip-hop record, more hip-hopness. And so there's this positive feedback loop, this positive sum outcome that these labels serve. Now, at the same time, I was reading about the history of a group called the Royal Society, which began in 1660 in London. And it was a group of academics who met in the pub every week, and they decided to form a club based around the idea of proving facts through evidence rather than the decree of the church or the king. So to do this, they started publishing the very first zines called Philosophical Transactions, and this is where they attempted the first experiments. And through this iterative process of people writing about trying to experiment with things, the scientific method was invented, peer review was invented. It's where Benjamin Franklin published his kite experiment. The first computer was funded through this, the first microscope. All of these things were made through this publication. And it was a group of people who were working together to try to establish the idea that facts could be proven. And what I came to see was that both of these projects were fundamentally doing the same thing. They were groups of people who shared the same worldview, releasing work in a shared context. And so they were making science happen. They were making punk rock happen. It wasn't just one product or one person. It was an iterative process by which people expressed themselves in the same aesthetic, same shape, same form, same ideas, but under a shared identity. So I called this concept a meta-label. This was the structure that was existing underneath what people were doing together. Now, this idea that breaks will spark breakthroughs, there's actually some interesting precedent for this. Ancient wisdom speaks of the power of retreat, and especially this need for artists to step back from the limelight. There's a quote from Joseph Campbell in The Hero with a Thousand Faces, where he says, "Willed introversion is one of the classic implements of creative genius and can be employed as a deliberate device, and here what you see on the screen. It cannot be described as an answer to any specific call, rather as a deliberate, terrific refusal to respond to anything but the deepest, highest, richest answer to the as yet unknown demand of some waiting void within. When we create those pauses, that's that willed introversion, and we're allowing the world to recede and what's inside to come forward. And this is where new ideas and breakthroughs tend to happen for us. The meta-label experience really made me realize something kind of obvious, but that as individuals, our powers are limited, but in groups we become stronger. And I started noticing a lot of interesting group-like projects that I hadn't quite seen the same way before. Say a project like Odd Future, which is a group of high school kids in LA in the mid-2010s that got together when Tyler, the creator, wanted to make a zine about hip-hop and fashion and skateboarding, his loves. So he got together a group of friends. They didn't end up making the zine, but he had the thought of, what if we made a Tumblr and we operated like a record label? And we had a strict schedule, and we're dropping work all the time because some of us rap, some of us are photographers, some of us do fashion, and let's just make work that way. And so Odd Future began doing that, and they became a cultural phenomenon with people like Earl Sweatshirt and Frank Ocean and Steve Lacy, the internet. Lots of amazing artists came out of this, including Tyler. And it came from this configuration, this collective, where if one person in the group dropped something, they're all gonna hype it, and they created a shared context that they all leapt out of together. This is similar to another project, Mischief, based in Brooklyn, who have crazy viral drops every few weeks that the press spends a lot of time trying to understand what they're doing. But Mischief is operating like a label, iteratively putting out releases that just show how absurd commercial culture can be. And this is similar to what we see with the Royal Society. So a group of kids standing for hip hop and skateboarding, a group of Brooklyn artists making crazy products, the Royal Society manufacturing science. These are all structures that are using a similar model of working together. The structure, again, of the meta label. We have a shared identity, iterative releases of work made by different selections of people, and with each one, the footprint and impact of that group grows. Now, where I think this ultimately leads is to a very different experience. In the first generation of the internet, the creative ecosystem was in single-player mode. We were all competing against each other to be the star, get as many followers as possible. But the internet is shifting. We are moving into a new era because we've been living with the results of this past one, and it's burnout, it's alienation. It's something that I often think about from the group K-Hole, a quote they had. Once upon a time, people were born into communities and had to find their individuality. But today, people are born individuals and have to find their community. This is where we are now. We're a generation brought up by the internet who are looking for where we belong with each other. Now, this is especially true of creative people who have been atomized by these tools and who have competed against each other for attentions and really our careers in a way that makes people who are similar frenemies and that creates divisions among us because we lack a way to collaborate. There's not an easy path for us to do things together. They're onerous or they don't really serve our needs very well. And this is the change that MetaLabel is hoping to make happen. It's not just about being the star, it's about being a constellation, being a part of, oh no, I have the wrong, we're just gonna flip through this part, sorry, I forgot this was in here. We're keeping it live. There's this arc of change of shifting from just be the star to instead it's be part of the constellation. It's not competing, it's cooperating because we've reached the limits of the previous system. It can't take us any farther, and now it's about finding ways that we can work together to create new cultural impact and better outcomes for all of us. Now, I could imagine in the near future, labels could even become something like corporations for creative people, a legal structure that lets a group of artists share resources, have some basic legal protection, have some shared identities, certain rights in certain places. Maybe we could imagine there's an A Corp, an artist corp, that has special provisions or is allowed to operate in ways that bridge nonprofit and for-profit and then reflect the reality that creative people have today. But if I take all these meditations together, I can see a path forward. We make work that's to me rather than the mean. We see ourselves as our audience and make work that we would like. We appreciate the moments when we're small, and we even make moments intentionally small to celebrate it even more. We approach our work as a practice and let it grow into a cathedral. We use world building to strengthen our resolve and our creative fortitude. We don't seek the inner ring, we create our own ring by following our own path. We give ourselves time out to reset and to find new ideas. We seek others to make work with and who we can support each other. And we look to not just be a star, but to be a part of a constellation. Now, we're all going to be in different steps of our journey. Maybe some parts of this resonated more with you than others. But I think it's important to consider the possibilities that are in front of us as individual creative people and as collectively. If we can find our voice, stay true to it, and find others with whom we share that. All right, thank you for hanging out with me on my desktop. I have a meeting in 1 minute, so we're stopping just in time. But I hope you enjoyed this release and this piece. Thank you.